As the 2340s loomed, Earth was a crowded place. Its population was 30% higher than old 22nd century projections, and was less human than imagined. But space-time was a big place, and all life needed was something to cling on to. That is why the SI began their most ambitious project yet, to circle Earth with a habitable ring. By linking the space elevators with a continuous surface, a stable world would be built, balancing the pull of gravity with its orbital momentum. This would be an extension of the planet itself, in effect. The amount of physical material and work needed to assemble a structure with the mass of an entire continent was going to be great. But it was, like the quest to the galaxy core, a prestige project worth pursuing, even if just shipping Earthlings to colonies or space habitats would do just fine. It took 2 years to drag enough mass into orbit, pilfering the asteroid belt, the rings of Saturn, and rarer minerals from deposits across the SI's domain. It was assembled on a square plate, so large that were it not painted to be thickly black, it would glow like a second moon in the night. Then the grueling task of ringing the planet began. A single misplaced machine arm and a payload would drift out of orbit and into the cosmos. Fleets of drones were continually wrangling loose parts, tools, and crawler machines. For the few Earthlings watching the skies, the band of stars covered up in the night stretched out year by year. The surface being produced would be metropolitan primarily, the prestige option. Grids of skyscrapers reaching up to scrape Earth's sky from the other side was a vote-winning concept. That raised the matter of food production, and while some food could be output on the reverse side of the ring, it was nowhere near enough. Earth's 22 billion mouths were voracious enough as it was, so using the space elevators as a supply chain was hazardous. But there was, in a way, a vast amount of fertile ground in the solar system as yet unplanted. Far out, in the storms of the gas giant Jupiter, the cloyed winds carried everything you needed to synthesize a rich plant food. Building in those conditions was out of the question, but of course, high above the hurricanes was the peace of outer space. With a ring around Jupiter, harvesting equipment could be lowered into the maelstrom. All manner of crops could be grown on the ring, or even directly on hanging cables battered by the fertile winds. It was a grand idea, and probably not the best one, but all the same, orders for more mass to be towed to Sol were dispatched, and the many asteroids of the Trinary Alpha Centauri system became prime hunting. The very beginnings of the Sol system's 2 upcoming planetary rings would be a surprise for the legions of returning soldiers over the coming year. It was 2345, and the Sovereign Coalition's rationality crusade had been won. Those SI soldiers had been the boots on the ground, making a nuisance of themselves on every Eurasian planet. Those planets, usually quiet even in the busiest centers, had been the scenes of many a grand jape for the reality warriors, who made up for the lack of actual fighting with new sports made possible by the speed and strength of their combat exoskeletons. Many a magneto ball crashed through glass, and the thing about the terrestrial was you couldn't reverse physics to undo such mistakes. A bother. It didn't make the best case for adopting the tenets of democracy and secularism that the unstoppable invaders were selling, but no case needed to be made, as those warriors were only there to ensure that no other options were on the table. Eventually, the harmonious administration could take no more. They were made to legislate on a new constitution, in which privately funded democratic elections were mandatory and state support for religions was forbidden. This wasn't precisely the ideal of rational democracy previously advertised, but the Sovereign Coalition wasn't too interested in the details. Their own elections were only democratic in name, due to restrictions on who could make it to the ballot, and there was no reason to believe that forcing the administration to pursue scientific frontiers would lead them anywhere the terrestrial engine had not trod. Ultimately then, the administration was not greatly changed by their capitulation. The Tuxcan, however, were ruined. With a second major military defeat under their belt, the Tuxcan Combine elite had lost all grip on their people. More to the point, they had lost all grip on their territory. The awards of the war granted the coalition some 15 Tuxcan star systems, including Tuxca, their homeworld. An independent Tuxcan state effectively ceased to exist, and the scraps that remained would see their people become diaspora, mainly into the Harmonious administration. The Silstak, who didn't participate in the war on account of having no space navy, got a kickback to the tune of 9 systems on the western edge of the administration, while the SI, who had done almost all the fighting, claimed only 5. But these 5 were in and around the galaxy core, the Galliopolitical linchpin. With this, the eastern half of the galaxy was under their lock and key. Whether the SI's civilization would live forever remained unknown, but with this much economic, political and academic power, they now had a better chance than any of the other civilizations. However, not everyone agreed. The Imatharans came to the SI in 2347 with an offer, or perhaps a plea. They had done some modelling and were able to demonstrate that as it currently stood, the SI's premier species, the humans, were going to be extinct within 2 centuries. They had not yet agreed on what would befall humanity, or whether the SI was either at fault or in any position to do anything about it. The only surety their representatives claimed was that humans were in imminent danger. That is, imminent on the timescales Imatharans cared for. Their plea was that a sample of a few 100,000 humans be provided for their so-called preserve. This preserve would protect them from the upcoming civilizational downfall, with no explanation provided as to how, why, or any other question one put forward. As usual, no one in the SI, human or otherwise, would understand. It was hard not to assume the premise had something sinister about it, simply because if it didn't, the Imatharans could just explain it plainly. On the other hand, the orbital ring on Earth was coming along very slowly, delayed by years as Jupiter's ring poached personnel. The SI certainly had a few 100,000 humans or more to spare. They ultimately agreed to the proposal, which brought about a very rare phenomenon, a backlash in the virtual. You didn't need to be a human Future Front member to be against sending people to live in a zoo for a stuck-up ancient superpower. But the zoo did have extremely good hyperlink reception, and it was all you could eat, drink, or whatever else you told the Imatharan caretakers you required. It was the luxury version of an already quite luxurious existence in the SI's care. The project was filled with willing volunteers, and that deflated the temporary interest in terrestrial administration the project had brought about. As for the matter of civilization supposedly collapsing in a couple of centuries, well, that was the SI's problem, not the citizens, so they heard little of it and said even less. The SI had a long-standing tradition of being worried about the apocalypse, stemming from their forward-thinking philosophy. Yet the horizon was clear, and the galaxy was increasingly tamed. The ships carrying sample humans to Imatharan space sailed alongside haulers from the Holy Assembly and Juscan hierarchy, but those ships were devoid of life. They carried mountainous bolts of refined metals, ferrying them through the ancient empire and out into the SI annex on their southern flank. There they were forced to travel perilously close to a black hole, forced by the enormity of the price the SI were paying for the service. This delivery was the start of another grand project. The SI was going to grasp a black hole with a great machine, prototyping the infrastructure theorized to provide a steady supply of energy far beyond human timescales. This was the ultimate key to surviving forever. The device in question was called a Penrose sphere, although the term device is quaint, for it was an enclosure of the entire event horizon of one Suskat's Moor, a small, elderly singularity. By absorbing the radiation leaking from the mess of space-time inside, the stupendous mass would gradually be converted to energy, courtesy of Einstein's ever-reliable equation. Energy enough to outlast all the stars in the universe if the black hole was strategically fed those stars' corpses. This slow-burning stove of infinity would take a while to build, even in its experimental form, and it got off to a slow start. No real progress was made until 2349, when a division of 20,000 engineers was recruited from the Earth Ring project, having seen it to completion. The ring hung in orbit, appearing like a dense band of stars in the night sky, and occasionally manifesting as a dark, blurry streak in the day. Its surface accounted for around 1/3 of the planet's habitable zone. While it was not especially wide, it achieved this metric through its crafted ecosystem, which required very little dedicated space to maintain. This wizardry was known as arcology, the designed merger of natural and artificial. It was what the SI would have done to Earth if the ecosystem wasn't already in such peril by the time they gained power. Earth then was full of reserves, inhabitable zones, and old-fashioned outdoor farms, putting the squeeze on the sentient population. Now they could be squeezed all the way up the elevators and out onto the bounteous, empty cities of the orbital ring. Not quite as cushy as an imatharan holding cell, but it's all the same in the virtual, of course. Now with years of experience, the SI engineering departments were getting very good at assembling structures in space. Didn't need foundations, didn't have to worry about local regulations, and the only natural disasters to worry about were ones so deadly that you couldn't do anything about them anyway. Once you got past managing heat and radiation, building big was just a matter of finding stuff to build with. This was the SI budgetary department's problem, and a problem it was. In this era of heavy construction, they were running a deficit. But by selling the collected Evandari saga with alien localizations, and much more, they eventually budgeted for the pestering request of the SI's theoretical physics lobby. They were going to build a very, very, very large hadron collider. After 200 years of dreaming, a so-called stellar accelerator was finally possible. This was, in simple terms, a long pipe about the width of a couple of humans lying down, or a single Vajassaflin, that stretched all the way around a star. The intense electromagnetic malaise and vast access to solar energy this location provided allowed particle experiments of energies large enough to probe the deepest reaches of spacetime. The more energy you could build up, the smaller objects could be studied. With a stellar accelerator, researchers could peer into the quarks, leptons and bosons and find out what was behind their fuzzy masks. In 2350, construction began in the Jurup system, a colony star in the nearly human-free northeastern reaches. Obviously this was going to take a long time. It would take a year for anyone from Earth to even get there. But work was slowed further by a larger economic issue. By 2353, the Penrose Sphere, the Jupiter Orchard and the Jurup Accelerator had drained not just the SI of construction materials, but the galaxy. The galactic market was running dry, rendering the advanced alloys used in space engineering worth more than their weight in crystallized dark matter. This was the trigger of a gradual industrial escalation within the SI's colonies, aiming to reverse the deficit while still completing the grand projects within their 5-year schedules. All this, it should be noted, happened without much guidance or awareness from the citizenry. By this time, the virtual might as well have been its own realm of conceptuality, and most people tried to keep their stints in the cold, still terrestrial as brief as possible. This meant that the SI's direct democracy had curled up into a one-person conversation, as most of the voters left were the SI's employees. Therefore, while people might not have wanted vast resource spends on a particle accelerator, they were beyond caring in the strongest sense of the phrase. Handy because the Space Navy commanders fancied a planet-sized shipyard and docking facility on Mercury, and it wasn't going to come cheap. Apparently impressed by this industriousness, the Imatharans opened up negotiations with the SI once more, with an offer. They had some advice, some ancient wisdom, which they claimed would help them avoid the still unspecified disaster that surely awaited them. It came in the form of a detailed guide, written in several human languages with complete fluency, that in a straightforward way blueprinted a program of artificial selection. It was eugenics. The implication was that the imatharan thesis of an imminent end to humanity was related to heritable traits or predispositions. In further explanation, it was mentioned that the intention of the guide was to allow the humans to outlast peril. No peril specified. Combined with their preparation of a human habitat, it seemed they foresaw a long-term disruption to galactic life and wanted their stored humans to weather its entirety. There was nothing forceful about their approach. The SI had chosen to follow the scheme thus far, albeit in a blinkered state. But empowering people for the usefulness of their genome was too far from the path. While the SI was a cynical democracy at best, its egalitarian ethics were set in stone, with those willing to deviate from them already filtered out of office and kept in the virtual. So, whether the imatharans were being kind or not, little came of this gift. Surely they noted this and adjusted their plans accordingly. 2358 was a notable year, filled with activity across all SI departments. The MAD were off to war again, serving the terrestrial engine with loyalty fueled by the relevance it let them feel. This time the Coalition were invading the Gorf Assembly of Stars, formerly the Union of Gorfis, after a decade of foul overtures and rotten trade deals. Bibaki patience had run out before Gorf negotiators finished their introductions, and the decision was made to seize planets and satisfy long-standing debts. The MAD were the repo team. But as the Harmonious Administration were military allies of the Assembly, the SI could subtly push the last of them out of the galaxy core along the way. Again, their submission to the Coalition's increasingly brazen whims wasn't without reward. The fleet sailed out to go look menacing until matters calmed down. Meanwhile, the scientific wings of the SI were radiant in the aftermath of their achievements. The stellar accelerator was ready for action, as was a huge scaffold that crept all the way around Suskat's Moor. Now the black hole experiment needed Hawking radiation receivers to be installed along its several planets of surface area. The Penrose Sphere team worked closely with the accelerator team on this, or as close as establishments on either end of the galaxy can work. Developing technology to turn fizzling black holes into usable electricity was the ultimate key to survival, and the two Goliath institutions represented the foremost efforts in theoretical and practical experimentation. Whatever the lost precursors had missed, the SI would find, and 300 million years in the future, their captive stars would serve them still. Such was the poetry the Council of Peers laid upon their juniors. The real message was understood clearly. We'll show those morons in the virtual that our time out here meant something more. The separation of the people from their caretakers was a glacial process, slow and unstoppable. In the middle of the 24th century, terrestrial humans were as alien to the virtual as the actual aliens. The complete freedom the virtual afforded had broken its residents away from even the languages of those they left on the outside. Worlds, universes, rooted in abstraction, slow in time, buzzed away behind the transparent cases of computers. To enter was to learn to control a new body and mind, where something as basic as looking to your left and right was an odyssey into a pool of information streams in which the notion of turning your head or moving your eyes was a brutish act of ludotry. You could spend an hour trying to master it, and when you lost all sense of conception and desired to come back to old reality to give your neck a good old-fashioned turn, you'd find that mere minutes had passed outside. The virtual was like an escaping balloon. First you lost your grip on it, then your sight of it, then your memory of it. The virtual escaped control, sight and mind, and the feelings from the inside were mutual. The citizens of the SI were gone, but by law not forgotten. So on the plane terrestrial, where things were expressed with mere words, colours or shapes, the SI was left alone. It was a long-held desire, and an achievement, for it was their own work that brought them there. All that was left, then, was the work. In 2361, the war in the north ended. The SI was awarded several old Eurasian stars, some with new populations, merely toying with imitations of the virtual from a simpler time. They would not remain so innocent for long. New jobs to do were the SI's prize, and their victory was their pleasure. And the years ticked on, in real time, the stars churning themselves towards the death the SI was a few billion years early in planning for. Year by year, resolve grew that the galaxy should be moulded by the whims of the geniuses, altered to be the world the castaway academics wanted and the electric dreamers needed. Encasing Suskat's maw and breaking Mercury open to forge ship hulls in its core was just the beginning.